Good morning to you all. It's lovely to see you all here. I'm talking really about communities and property level protection. And property level protection is just one way of reducing flood risk for flood areas. But to be truly effective, we need to work with communities to gain their support. After all, it is the street that they live on, and it is their homes that we will have this implemented with. So as agencies and authorities, I'm sure you have found that negotiating the minefield of understanding the process of installing PLP has had its challenges. So you can begin to imagine what it must be like for those at grassroots. PLP provokes many thoughts and feelings, and amongst property owners, suspicion, property value, reliability, insurance. How it's all going to look are just a few. But many will not have heard of it, and there is nowhere to go and see samples collectively, unless you live in Cumbria. And knowledge about the importance of a survey will really have not been contemplated. So this begins to show how crucial it is to talk to residents collectively and before the process begins, enabling an understanding to take place. Ideally, the formation of a flood action group creates a good liaison between those implementing the scheme and the wider community. You might be thinking, fine, if we have the time. We are already stretched to complete in the time span that we have. But if we have put in a bid and therefore realise there is a possibility, we could be starting communications with residents, and it will pay dividends to invest the time early. Flood action groups teaming up with local voluntary sectors ensure that property level protection schemes work to their optimum. And you can see in the slide here that the community flood group is really at the heart and the hub of all the communication. We have the community flood group working with the agency authorities who are responsible for reducing flood risk. But we also have them working alongside the voluntary group to support the emergency plan that is made in partnership. But also, the community flood group is instrumental in disseminating information out into their wider community. Training given to volunteers ensures their personal safety and their understanding of fitting protection products correctly, which again is crucial that the community has that support when property level protection is insulated. And you can see in these pictures here, this is a recent training day that the National Flood Forum did with Buckingham, where they would talk about health and safety from first responders, risk assessments, and also in how to install property level protection at time of need correctly. So a good example, as I've just mentioned, is in Buckinghamshire, where the National Flood Forum has worked to support this community. And I would like to introduce you to Roger, who's chair of the Flood Action Group. And as Charles has already mentioned, unfortunately, Steve, who is from Churches Together organisation, is unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, unable to attend. But Roger will be covering Steve's presentation.
Good morning, Roger Parkinson. I think I've got my first slide up. And it's a journey from I don't care, I wasn't bothered about flooding, to I'm now the president of the Flood Action for Buckingham Group. So quite the journey. From listening to the previous presenters, what I'm going to do is echo some of the things that they've said as a case study. That it is a very complex situation, nobody has all the answers, and we're all learning together. So in Buckingham, we've flooded constantly since 1908. I moved to Buckingham in '88. There was no mention at all of flooding. It never came up anywhere. In 1998, we had a major flood. my house flooded to this depth. In 2007, again, we had another major flood, and we're now a 1 in 50% chance of flood risk. So after the 98 flood, the government looked and said, well, it's a 1 in 100-year event. It's unlikely to be a problem. You're down there in terms of resources. In 2007, when we became a 1 in 50% chance of flooding, the government then started to look at what they could do. They looked at a number of macro schemes, such as increasing the flood areas, holding areas for the river. But every time they came up with one idea or another, there was an interested group who said, no, we don't want that on our doorstep. If it was blocking the river, the Buckingham Society said, why do we want 9 years of not being able to enjoy the river to save 1 day of flooding? So the answer came down to property level protection, and there was about 96 to 100 homes that were affected in Buckingham. So, in all those years, what changed? Why did we go from a 1 in 100 year to 1 in 50 years? And why has it suddenly become important that flooding is in everybody's minds? Well, the way we changed the use of our property. This slide doesn't show too well, but when I moved to Buckingham, I took over an old Georgian house, Georgian Victorian. The stone floor was basically sat on earth. If you spilt a glass of water, the water would go before you could get a cloth. And that's how they dealt with flooding. There was no expensive items on the ground floor, a cooker, a fire. There was actually a bathroom down there and a breakfast table. Since we took over, we now have a family room, TVs, DVDs, fitted kitchens, freezers, fridges, and now flooding is a totally different risk to us. So we've changed the property, and we've changed it from it was easy to get rid of the water to now it's a 6 to 9 month problem to rebuild basically the ground floor of the house. The other thing that's changed is the building around the floodplain. There's been several developments, and these developments have had flood mitigation schemes with them. They've been signed off, tested, and then later on found not to work. This building here had a specialist team come in and do a flood proofing because it was going to be done on the floodplain. They spent a lot of money getting all the foundations flood proofed. They then built all the units on top. The flood proofing didn't work. The flood proofing company went bankrupt, and now the developer has got a building where the car park floods from rising groundwater, and there's actually damp penetrating up the walls. So they've got a big problem to get round to solve this. So one of the things you want to look at is when people come to you with plans, what are they backed up by? If they've commissioned a company to develop a flood mitigation system, how good is it? If it doesn't work, what's the comeback? Because at the moment there doesn't seem to be any. We had a development put forward for houses at the back of my house. I was quite keen. I think houses at the back of my house would be quite nice. We had an old football field. Unfortunately, what we wanted to do was to lay a concrete foundation all the way along the back. And what they didn't take into account was that groundwater runs from the hills down the river. If they'd built this, then the back of my garden and the back of my house would have become a paddy field. So there's lots of things that when planning permission comes to you, you have to take into account and look at. So again, this is my personal trip. When we first flooded, it was a 1 in 100 year event, we were told. I was in my 40s, so that puts me 140. I don't care. Insurance companies paid out. Wonderful. All of my white goods replaced. It was like having every house refitted. A lot of people felt that way. Some people felt very distressed they were put out. So the different people in the community felt differently. But overall, that event was seen as a one-off in our lifetime, so everybody was happy. At the next 2007 event, we changed it to a 1 in 50% chance of flooding. This means that every year I've got a 1 in 50% chance of flooding. So you've now got my attention. You've gone from 1 in 100 years to 1 in 50 chance each year. They redrew the flood maps. My house is now in a floodplain. So when it comes to insurance companies key in my postcode, I come up with a high risk. But again, the insurance companies were wonderful. They paid up, they replaced all the white goods 7 years on. It was almost like a maintenance agreement. And then the government came forward with the personal property flood protection. Now, a lot of people after 2007 were looking at doing their own property level protection. But once they found out that there was potentially a grant to do it, everybody just stopped and waited for the local government to step in and do something. So my experience of the event of having property level flood protection put in, to me I had a few problems with it. The government agreed that an independent surveyor should survey the property, a separate contractor should do all of the work, and then the independent surveyor should survey the property afterwards again, and then the payments will be made. And this seemed like a nice handshake way of covering it. There was a problem with the surveyor's report in that there was so much bump in it that the real pages, there was really only one page, one statement of works that had to be done. However, buried 10 pages back down was the datums of where that work had to be carried out from. Now, when my door flood guards were fitted, the guy who measured them measured it from the garden level, not the threshold. So already my 600 millimetres was down 100 and something millimetres. He also took into account going into the ground another 100 millimetres, so they were actually installing a trip hazard. Now, when I stopped them and said, I want to take this further, the surveyor looked at his report and he said, yes, the report says up to 600 millimetres. So this 400 millimetres complied with the report, but it didn't comply with the what should have happened. So this mistake happened, and then everybody started to say, well, it's not me. My objective was to make sure this mistake never happens again. An engineer by background. So if you ever have a report done by a surveyor, have them get the separate pages for the datums and the schedules of work, and make sure that all the people involved in the implementation get this documentation, and then that problem will never happen again. One other issues was that a sump and pump was fitted. And at the time, there was very few suppliers of sumps and pumps in the UK. I know because I researched all of the products because I was going to do this work myself until I found out about the grant. The product that was fitted was from the US, and it was meant to be in the basements of US houses with a pipe that goes vertically 45 degrees and comes out at ground level. When the guy started fitting this in my house, in my living room, and wanted to put a vertical pipe up 3.5 feet, I said, this isn't right. So we agreed that the pipe could come up and could go sideways out the house. But as the sump and pump was underground, we later thought that it could go under the ground, the concrete could be filled in, and you wouldn't see anything in the living room. But now we've modified the pipe twice. Let's get a drink of water. Now we've modified the pipes twice, and they had to go and get some spares. And they found out that the product had come with imperial piping. it was a heck of a problem to find somewhere in the UK that still sells imperial piping. And so after that, when the council said, you've signed up for maintenance, I said, well, how do I maintain this when I can't buy any spares? The company that brought in the original devices set up a company in Birmingham that imports them, and they gave me an adapter from imperial to metric. So the whole business is fraught with problems. There's so many things that can go wrong. And what I wanted to do today was to try and explain to you what happened to me so that you can take note, and when you come to work with people doing property level protection, you can not make the same mistakes. I know of one other house in Buckingham that had the same mistake made, and that person would not complain. So he has an ineffective property level protection now. The other point is we were all asked to do annual maintenance and to take up annual maintenance. We received about £5,000 or £6,000 worth of government money spent in our houses. To date, I don't know anybody in Buckingham who's taken up a maintenance programme. They just don't do it. So as Flood Action for Buckingham, what we decided to do is one of the things we would do is we'd try and have everybody at least install their flood protection property once a year, and that would be some form of annual maintenance. You can't force people, but it seemed like a way to try and get the products tested and to make sure that they're effective on the night. The local flood group was formed. The Environment Agency with National Flood Forum wanted to set up local groups. Churches Together had a ready-made group of volunteers. So the first step was to approach Churches Together with the volunteers. It was felt it needed to be a bit wider and to take in the people who'd flooded. So they arranged a meeting, and out of the 96 people who had flood protection, 6 people turned up who'd been flooded, because now we're dry, nobody's bothered. They suggested setting up the group and asked for volunteers. I put my hand up, I looked round, and mine was the only hand that went up. With a bit of encouragement from Heather, we managed to get another 5 hands to go up. So now we had basically a flood committee that could start and try and increase the resilience. And Heather and the National Flood Forum also suggested that we should split into 2 groups. Those who flood have an interest in resilience, i.e. checking up on rivers, checking up on drains, checking up on culverts that are blocked. And our local council is very happy to have us ring them up and tell them about this, because they just don't have the manpower to go around and check everything. But also that when we actually do come to a flood, those who flood are going to be very busy protecting their own property. So the volunteers should be drawn from people outside of the flood group. Churches Together, and that's why we set up as two sections, resilience role and the volunteer role. The first thing we had was Data Protection Act. We can't tell you who are the vulnerable in your town, who needs help. We can't even tell you who's had flood protection, property level protection fitted under the Data Protection Act. So our first job was to, well, we know who's flooded, was to leaflet everybody and to set an opt-in system. If you want help or you want to be part of the group, please opt in. And we got about 60 people opted in. We still have a lot of people who don't care, don't want to be involved. Sometimes you can't force a horse to drink or eat. And also we ran the first annual event where we asked everybody to check their flood products. Called it a dry run, and we raised some funds. We needed things like printing. The Environment Agency was very helpful helping us do printing. But there was other things like we were using tables from somebody else's job and things like this. It was all very hatched together. What we didn't realise was that insurance was going to raise its ugly head, not in the terms of insurance of our properties, but insuring us as a volunteer group. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. The initial thoughts was, if a volunteer is out helping somebody move furniture and they damage the wallpaper while they're doing this, who's going to get sued? Is anybody going to get sued? The public can turn just like that. When things are going right and they're getting everything they want, they think you're wonderful. If you do something wrong, then they can turn on you quite viciously. So we felt it was important that the volunteers should have some sort of insurance cover. We also had our first legal threat. We put a small ad in the Buckingham Matters, a town magazine that goes out to all the residents of Buckingham. We took a street scene of Wells Street in the flood of 2007, and we wrote our details about Flood Action for Group, how we could help people, asking for volunteers. Somebody was selling their house on that road and hadn't told the buyer that it was a flood area. So they immediately got their lawyers to get in touch with us and said that they were going to sue us for any losses if the sale fell through. So that was our first red flag warning. What I didn't also realise was that anybody who volunteers and uses the car, if you don't tell the insurance company that you are a volunteer, your car insurance is null and void. Not any of us knew that. Having done our first annual event, the town council thought, you've got something here. So they've given us a section in the market on a Saturday morning in July. And they said, can you send me your certificate of public liability? Public liability? So again, we now have more insurance that we have to try and put together. Now fortunately our local council stepped in and they're going to insure the volunteers as council employees, as voluntary flood wardens. But there was an issue that they had to get round in that they have to pay the minimum hourly rate. And so there was some internal jiggery-pokery to be able to be volunteers on a no-pay scheme. They're also looking at the public liability, but again we have to have a risk assessment done, event management plan done, and the insurance company to insure us as volunteers also said that we had to have all of the volunteers trained on health and safety and a risk assessment done for the role they would carry out. So our volunteer group has now suddenly become quite complex and tied down in paperwork. But fortunately, National Flood Forum and our local council really are supporting us and knocking down these roadblocks as they come up. So the flood event of November 2012, this was last year. We claim as close as you could do to flooding. The water was about 6 feet away from my front door. We had to do a full emergency flood plan and get people motivated. You can't quite see on this one, but what we told to some of the volunteers was sometimes there is nowhere to move furniture to, so you might have to be inventive. And this is somebody's lifted furniture up here and stacked it on bricks, and to be nice to the people and the floor or whatever, they've put them in plastic bags. Regular communication. While we were out helping the people who'd flooded, or were about to flood, all the people who'd registered as vulnerable, we went out and fitted their flood defences for them. We only had one volunteer turn up, which we managed, but we could have done with more. And again, during that event, we had a number of issues that came up. One, where one of the volunteers went off and told people, he went round the knocking route to tell people to put the flood defences up. One of the people, it was a rented house, The tenant said, I'm not doing that, the river's not going to flood. The owner said, no, you should do it. They agreed, okay, maybe it's not going to flood. The owner then went away on business the next day, having told his wife that the flood warden had said, you don't need to put your flood protection up. The people who managed the house contacted the lady and said, you do, for insurance, have to put your flood defences up. So she rang me complaining that my flood volunteer had given her faulty information. And actually it was her husband who had given her faulty information. He just didn't want to argue with the tenant. So there's a number of issues that you're open to when you are out volunteering that are quite complex. So during that flood, or that potential flood, we never got flooded from the river. But we did have 3 flash floods. And that's why I said I was glad I came in after the other presentations. Because what we're seeing now is it's not the river that's going to flood, it's flash flooding. The flash flooding came from new builds where some of the houses were actually in a slight hollow. We'd had such tremendous, these houses have been there for 8 years, I call that new build. I live in a Victorian house. But this was the first time they'd been subject to such a deluge. They called the fire brigade, they had to take away the curbstone so the water could run out. Another new build that's underway of 700 houses. In the flood, in their planning permission, it says that they will build additional flood prevention, holding tanks and increase the drain sizes when they get to 700 homes. Now they've changed the land from green fields where it all soaked through, and it's now compacted, driven over earth with about 50 to 100 homes built. The water just flooded straight across off there, straight over the ring road and straight into a housing development that's been there for about 30 years. They'd never flooded before. And we had one home which flooded from rising groundwater, which is, again, you mentioned earlier on, the water table increasing. As the water table pushes up, it pushes up through these, it pushes up around the damp-proof membrane, where the damp-proof membrane goes to the wall, and it comes into your house like that. So again, as a flood group, we're going to continue to try and get people to be aware of flooding, keep it in their mind, keep testing their products. During the last flood event, I found 2 people who asked me on the night, at 9 o'clock at night, how do I fit my flood defences? And we had one lady say, do you have any spares? Because I've lost the spanner. So we want to promote greater self-help. We need to sort out this insurance. We need to get some documentation, because at the moment everything is by word of mouth that we're covered, but we really need to get something in writing. So if you have any flood groups starting up in your area, make sure you give them the information in writing so that they can feel secure in doing their volunteering work. I think I've gone on a little bit too long. Right, quickly turn my hat round. I'm now Steve Hallett. Steve's in charge of the volunteers, and the volunteer, what we're going to talk about today, or what he was going to talk about today, was the volunteer training. Again, the slide just says what I've said before, that Steve's group was contacted by the Environment Agency and the National Flood Forum. And one of the things we did while we, I think it works better here, one of the things we did while setting up the flood group was decided that we needed a town flood plan and we needed a personal flood plan. We did our first volunteer training in May, and this volunteer training was originally meant to be, how do you fit these devices? We knew all the devices we had in town, how do you fit them? With all of the insurance issues, it now became a case of you have to sit through this training before you can get the insurance for your liability under the council's insurers. So again, it took over a much more important role of the volunteer training. And again, Steve's going to say here that the flood volunteers need to raise the awareness of the town. We need to have the flood plan tested, not just the volunteers to go out and test and put in the flood defences, the personal flood defences, but we needed to test our flood plan. Did it work? In 2007, we got that real test, and yes, it did work. We didn't go through the evacuation procedures, but everything else went according to plan. So now we have a flood plan. We know who's at risk. We've been around, we've got everybody leafleted, and as mentioned before, we've got a certain amount of buy-in. And again, due to data protection, because we're not secure, we have to ask people to opt into our scheme, not that we'll come around and do things for you. So it's very much an opt-in scheme where we have to persuade people to opt in. And some of them don't want to until 9 o'clock on the night when they're flooding. We have, from the Environment Agency, flood alerts and flood warnings. Our plan starts with a flood alert, but really this, in Buckingham, isn't seen as the start of flooding. This is just if you need to get your flood defences out, now's the time to make sure you can get them out the garage or wherever, and that you've got all the spare bits. But as to fitting them, people don't tend to fit them at this stage. They are inconvenient. You cannot get in and out your house if you've got them all round, but you need to have them ready. So we use the flood warning as the trigger. That trigger, we will call all of the volunteers who are available to the local church. The reason it's the local church is it's the only place that's free, because we have no money, and Steve's got some good contacts and he's also got the keys. So we'll meet there and we'll assign roles and protective equipment. Aylesbury Vale was very good that they managed to get us a grant for protective equipment. In the 2007 flood, I got home, my feet were freezing, my coat was ruined, I'd had an awful night, it was pouring with rain, and I'd fitted 4 people's flood defences. So the council felt that yes, this is a good thing to spend money on, and also it tied in with the insurance requirement that if you have volunteers that are on your insurance, then they should have some form of protective equipment. The reason why we don't go on the flood alert is, as you can see, in 2012 there were 10 flood alerts. The one thing you mustn't do is continue to say it's going to flood, it's going to flood, it's going to flood, because people will stop believing you. And then when it really is going to flood, they won't believe you either. So we tend not to go out and do the door knocking routes and raise the awareness too highly at the flood alerts. But when we get to a flood warning, that's when our plan actually goes into operation. Now, everywhere is going to be different. We are one community, and our community knows exactly when we're going to flood. We don't need flood warnings, we don't need the Environment Agency. We have bricks, we can measure the water as it comes up the road towards the pub. We know when it gets dangerous, and we know that if the river in Tinswick is flooding, then we're going to get it in 4 hours' time. So the local community knows, and when they say, how high up is it towards the new inn? And you say, well, it's still about halfway down the road, everybody says, oh, don't worry, we're all right. The flood volunteers, their role is also to go around and tell people when it really is important to move their furniture and get the flood equipment out and installed. So we have a thing called door knocking routes. And the door knocking routes, we decided that rather than have somebody you don't know go around, we'd have somebody from the local area. So each volunteer is from that area. I did the one for Chandos Road in 2011. I've got my flood defences up. I've been out and fitted 4 flood defences. I'm coming back. I'm knocking on the doors saying, put your flood gear up. They said, oh, do you think we're going to flood, Roger? Yes. I go home. I've got my flood defences up, and all I can see is all of the outside lights down my road go on. So people have obviously come out the house, and now they're fitting the flood defences. So people will wait for that last call. So the door knocking routes are important. This is just a slide of detailed recommendations. You need to fit this to your specific area. This one has turn off gas and electricity. As I've got a sump and pump fitted, I will not turn my electricity off. Because if I do that, I'm going to flood. I'll just have a swimming pool downstairs. So ask the local people what's important to them and then get these lists drawn up. We also suggested that people have a personal flood plan rather than wait until the last minute. If you're going to be flooded and you're going to go out your house, pack your bag the night before as if you were going away for a weekend's holiday. Don't leave it till 9 o'clock when you're actually leaving your house to say, what do I need to take? If that's your situation, that's your flood plan. Your flood plan should be personal to you. I mentioned river monitoring. This is important for the Environment Agency and the Council so they can coordinate how the flood's rising, how the flood event's happening. And the volunteers, we've now instructed them on to how to read the gauges and things on the river. Whereas before, nobody actually knew what that gauge meant. And when the water level is, can't see it there, but on the night when the water level's here, and nobody can remember what exactly was underneath it on the gauge because they never looked at it before, they just said, it says 6. So we trained them how to look at it. We trained them that they need to look at the river. This is on the Environmental Agency's website. And this is good information. This is the river in Buckingham. When it gets to there, my house is about half a metre deep in water. But what we found out was that if you looked at the flood map for the river upriver, and you looked at the one downriver, then you could see how the water is going to change. And if at Tingewick it's bulging up and we're okay, then you know that in the next 3 to 4 hours we're going to flood. So again, this is local information. The local people can tell you. So rather than say, yeah, I know, sorry. And I think the last slide was volunteer equipment. I was going to mention and say that, I did say before, that Aylesbury Vale District Council were very kind in getting us this. One of their contractors who does the protective equipment, while one of their orders was going on, agreed to a donation to Flood Action for Buckingham, and now we've got quite a lot of protective clothing. And I think that's it. So that was a personal story. I hope it wasn't a whinge. It wasn't meant to be taken as a whinge. It's more of a, these are some of the things that can go wrong.